As Europe is gripped by the flames of World War II, an unprecedented battlefront unfolds in the east. The Eastern Front, where Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union clashed in one of the most brutal and unforgiving theaters of war in history. The Eastern Front in World War II was one of the largest and most brutal theaters of the conflict, stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. It saw some of the largest battles, highest casualties, and most significant strategic shifts in the entire war. Fought primarily between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union with limited involvement from Finland and Romania on Germany's side, the Eastern Front was pivotal in determining the outcome of World War II. Key phases and events. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, began on June 22, 1941. Hitler's ambition to conquer Soviet territories for Lebensraum, or living space, led him to break the non-aggression pact signed with Stalin in 1939. The Germans launched 3 major army groups towards Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kyiv in the south, rapidly advancing due to the element of surprise and the initial disorganization of Soviet defenses. Initial victories saw vast encirclements with millions of Soviet soldiers captured, but logistical issues, extended supply lines, and fierce Soviet resistance eventually stalled the German advance. Siege of Leningrad, 1941 to 1944. The Siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and deadliest sieges in history, lasted 872 days. Nazi forces aimed to encircle and starve the city rather than capture it directly. The Soviet population and soldiers within the city endured starvation and brutal winter conditions, with an estimated 1 million civilians dying from starvation and shelling. Despite unimaginable hardships, the Red Army held Leningrad, and the siege was eventually lifted in January 1944. The Battle of Moscow from 1941 to 1942 was a pivotal moment in World War II. As German forces approached Moscow in late 1941, Soviet reinforcements from the Far East bolstered the defense, taking full advantage of harsh winter conditions and the exhausted state of the German troops. The Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941 was the first major setback for the Wehrmacht, pushing them back from the capital and effectively halting their eastern advance. The Battle of Stalingrad, spanning from 1942 to 1943, marked a major turning point in the war. German forces aimed to capture the city due to its strategic and symbolic importance. The brutal, close-quarters urban warfare led to massive casualties on both sides. The Soviet encirclement of the German Sixth Army in the winter of 1942 to 1943 trapped tens of thousands of German soldiers. The German surrender in February 1943 marked a significant psychological and strategic defeat for Nazi Germany as the Soviet Union began to take the offensive. The Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Hitler sought to regain the initiative by striking at a Soviet bulge around the city of Kursk. However, Soviet forces anticipated the attack, constructing deep defensive lines and heavily reinforcing their positions. The failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk marked a permanent shift in momentum, with Soviet forces launching a counteroffensive that would carry them steadily westward. Operation Bagration in June 1944 was a massive Soviet offensive aimed at destroying German Army Group Center. It was one of the most successful and devastating offensives of the war, leading to the near-total destruction of German forces in Belarus. The Red Army advanced over 300 miles in just over 2 months, paving the way for the Soviet advance into Poland and ultimately toward Germany. By early 1945, the Soviet Union was advancing on multiple fronts. The final offensive into Germany led to the Battle of Berlin, one of the most intense and destructive battles of the war. Soviet forces encircled Berlin, leading to Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, and Germany's surrender on May 7th. The Eastern Front was marked by its massive scale, stretching thousands of miles with battles involving millions of troops. Civilian populations suffered immensely, facing mass executions, forced labor, and devastating famine. The war on the Eastern Front was also driven by ideological hatred, as Nazi policies sought to annihilate the Jewish Bolshevik threat, leading to horrific crimes against civilians, including the Holocaust and the extermination of entire towns. The harsh Russian winters played a significant role in shaping the course of the conflict, stalling German advances and causing considerable suffering and losses due to cold, starvation, and disease. The Eastern Front was decisive in weakening Nazi Germany, absorbing vast resources and manpower and inflicting enormous casualties on the Wehrmacht. An estimated 26 to 27 million Soviet citizens, both soldiers and civilians, lost their lives. The Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, but at a staggering human cost, and the brutality and suffering of the Eastern Front left scars that would influence Soviet policies and relations with the West for decades.